Never again do I walk the night shift alone after that string of nights, and I still feel my stomach drop when I think about the way he moved through the hours like he owned the dark. My name is Alex. I was 28 then, and I had worked the graveyard crew at a 24-hour truck stop and diner on the outskirts of a Midwestern town for 3 years. I was the kind of person who learned to catalog the small noises of a business that never slept: the clink of coffee cups at 3 a.m., the soft thud of a delivery cart, the sigh of an old refrigerator that never stopped humming. The job paid the rent and bought my gas, but it also taught me a kind of warped vigilance. I grew up in a small town 2 hours from where the truck stop sits, the son of a mechanic who taught me to notice oil stains and loose bolts, and the girl next door who became a memory when my father died in a winter shop accident. That loss hardened me into someone who felt safer awake than asleep. I studied hospitality for a little while until bills pulled me into night shifts. I learned to handle rude customers, to patch a broken soda machine, to reset the keycard reader when it glitched. I also learned to hold my fear in my throat until I had to speak. In the months before what I call the run of 4, I had been alone more nights than not. I had friends at work, people like Janet who covered barista shifts on Tuesdays, Tom who managed the overnight logistics, Marcus who did maintenance, Ethan the trucker who slept in a corner booth sometimes, Maya the late kitchen prep who hummed off-key, and Sam the night security who drove the rounds. Each had their own rhythms that fit into my pattern of watching and waiting. The truck stop itself was a long rectangle of fluorescent light and vinyl, a thin lobby with a soda machine and a wall of trucker magazines, a diner with chrome stools, an attached motel with a manual key rack and a narrow set of corridors, and a small gas island out front with cameras mounted like sleepy owls. The air at night tasted like burnt coffee and cold grease, with an occasional sweetness of spilled syrup left to crystallize on the counter. The floor always felt slightly sticky underfoot, and the radio at the counter played an oldie station low enough to leave a hollow in the room where silence could creep. Most nights were predictable in the way a clock is predictable. But the night I first noticed him, the rhythm broke and did not go back together. I will tell you exactly what I felt and what I saw, because I checked the camera logs, I filed a report, and I remember the sting of being dismissed and a later proof that made people listen. The first time he came in, he walked like a person who practiced being invisible. He wore a dark jacket, a cap pulled low, and his jeans were worn at the knees. He carried a small duffel with a strap that rubbed the same quiet beat against his hip as he moved. He paid cash at the counter for coffee and a slice of pie, and he did not look like any trucker I knew. He smelled faintly of cold smoke and pennies, a split second of metallic tang when he walked past the register that I could almost not place. He sat at the far corner booth and watched the door as if it were a stage. I remember the way the fluorescent light made his cheekbones look almost hollow. He seemed ordinary until he did not. At some point, I walked over to clear plates, and he tilted his head slowly and said, "Hey there, how was your night?" I froze because my instinct told me to, but I answered, "Fine, thanks. You need anything else?" He smiled, the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes, and he said, "Just waiting. Long night for you." I said, "Always." He said, "You look tired." I said, "Not as tired as the coffee." He said, "Coffee never quits on me." It felt like small talk until his hand tapped the table in a rhythm I could feel in my teeth. He said, "Do you like the cameras here?" I laughed because it seemed a ridiculous question, and I said, "As long as they work, they keep me from worrying." He said, "They do not always work the way you think." He looked at me like he was telling me a secret, and I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "People slip past what the cameras take and stay in places they are not supposed to." He said, "You would not believe how quiet a place can be when the lights make shadows for you." He said it quietly, and then he was quiet, and I felt the temperature of the room drop. This was our first conversation, and there were at least 9 exchanges. With my voice small and his measured, each question and answer a thread that pulled me toward noticing his hands, the thin scar on his knuckle, the way he kept checking the entry door while his eyes never left my face.
That first encounter did not end with violence, but with a slow unease that unpacked itself over the next few weeks. I did not file an incident because nothing clearly illegal had happened, and the manager, Tom, joked that paranoia was part of the price we paid for midnight wages. Tom said, "If he bothers you, tell him to leave." I said, "He's not bothering anyone yet." He said, "Keep an eye." The first expansion of the problem came with small anomalies that stacked like
paper plates in a cupboard until they toppled. The keycard log for the motel showed entries that did not match any registered check-ins. A room I had handed to a late couple at 2 a.m. was flagged in the ledger as vacant. The cameras seemed to have tiny blind spots under the eaves where someone could stand and not wake up a sensor. At night, I walked the floor and felt the pebble of the security key between my fingers like a prayer. Several times I thought I heard steps in the thin hallway outside the motel doors that did not match any of our recorded guests. The sound of rubber soles dragged slowly like someone pacing to count doors. Once I smelled bleach and old cigarettes in a corridor that had never been cleaned for hours. My coworkers started noticing too. Janet said, "I found a Polaroid on the counter like someone paid with a photo instead of cash." Ethan said, "I heard voices through the vents like a radio with the wrong station." Marcus said, "My toolbox was moved an inch on the cart like someone fiddled with it to see if there was something inside." Maya said, "I found a scribble on the prep list with a license plate number and nothing else." Sam did a round and noted a beat-up sedan that parked off the lot, just under the shadow of the sign, where the light did not reach. We, the night crew, were a patchwork of small alarms. I started to review camera footage in the slow hours. I rewound time and watched frames where a figure crossed areas where clients did not usually go. The man in the jacket did not come alone always. Sometimes there was a second shape trailing behind him like a bad reflection. I remember watching a clip where one of them stood at the glass of a motel room window and the other walked down the hall placing his hand on doors as if testing locks. The footage had grain and hiss, and in the playback the air looked thick and slow like syrup. I smelled the oil boiled in the fryer while I watched and felt the plastic edge of the monitor under my palms. I began to keep a log myself, and I named the second figure in my head the tail. The pattern grew stranger. They appeared at odd intervals, sometimes 3 nights in a row, sometimes disappearing for a week and returning. On one night, the man left a small blank Polaroid face down on the counter and a cigarette butt in the ashtray that smelled like winter rooms and hospital corridors. The cigarette had no band, and the ash ashy gray like the ceiling in the storage room. My chest tightened each time I discovered a new piece. I called Tom and I said, "We have people scouting the rooms." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Watch the cameras." He said, "I do not want to panic." I said, "We need to call someone if they touch doors." He said, "Call me first." The tension moved into a physical ache. One night, I followed the pattern and confronted the pair by the pumps. There were at least 9 exchanges in that confrontation, spread across voices and breath. I remember the cool rain on my arms, the rubber smell of the hose, the distant hum of an 18-wheeler idling on the highway. I walked to the pump and said, "You cannot park there at night." The man looked up slow, and his partner, a thinner guy with a hoodie pulled tight, took a step back and said, "We are just waiting on a friend." I said, "There are no friends that do that." The man put his hands up like he wanted to placate and said, "We trade shifts, we wait." I said, "You are scaring people." The man said, "People are always scared. They just name the thing." A driver in a pickup stepped out and said, "Hey, mind your business." The man looked at the driver and said, "No worries, I will move." But he did not move. Sam rolled up and said, "You two need to leave the premises now." The thinner guy laughed and said, "Or what?" Sam put his hand on the radio and said, "Unless you want the police here." The man in the jacket said softly, "Police make noise. Noise makes people run." He smiled, and I felt my throat close. The driver in the pickup muttered and went back in. The rain felt like nails on my shoulders.
I called the non-emergency line out of a need to document, not for help yet, and the dispatcher said they would log it and send a cruiser if the situation escalated. We never got the immediate attention I hoped for. The real escalation came 3 nights later when I checked the camera of the motel corridor and saw the jacket man slide a keycard under a door and then wait. The footage showed him listening at the crack and then slipping something small through the gap. The way his hand moved was calm, practiced. My skin felt papery under my sleeves. I rewound and watched the moment where the card withdrew and the hallway lights flickered in a staccato, an odd electrical hiccup we had not been able to explain. The man walked away, and a truck idling outside flashed its lights once, like an answer. I confronted the motel occupant at breakfast because the guest had stayed awake and said to me, "Someone slipped a card under my door at 3 a.m." Who said, "Do you have any idea who did it?" The guest said, "I heard someone at the door, then nothing." He looked pale under his coffee. The guest gave a license plate and a description, and I cross-referenced my notes. Then the nights turned worse. A regular came and handed me a crumpled receipt and said, "Found this outside when I went to smoke." On the receipt was a phone number and the initials HA. The receipt was the same brand as the jacket man had used to pay his pie. The pattern screamed at me in the way an animal sounds warning. I called Officer Ruiz and left a message with the details and the camera timestamps. He called back the next afternoon and said he would send someone by to look at the footage. In the exchange between me and Officer Ruiz, there were at least 8 back and forths of information and recheck. He said, "Bring me the files." I said, "I have them." He said, "Stay safe." I said, "We are doing what we can." He said, "I will follow up." When they did come, they were polite and procedural. Sergeant Lewis came with a flashlight that smelled like the inside of a locker, and his partner Chavez. They watched the footage with a kind of steady, exhausted sympathy. Sergeant Lewis said, "This looks like trespass and possible tampering." I said, "They are testing the locks." He said, "We can file a report and see if any plates match." He said, "How many nights?" I said, 4. He said, "We will run nearby cameras." He also told me to keep a log and not to approach if I felt threatened. That felt like advice and not rescue. The turning point happened when the police cross-referenced the plate numbers that had been scribbled and found a match to a stolen vehicle. They ran a serial on the duffel we had imaged from the video and came back with nothing. The breakthrough came when Ethan the trucker, who slept sometimes in his cab, shared a clip he had taken with his phone of 2 men near a storage shed by the rear lot where we kept pallets. The clip was shaky and small, but it showed a third person at a distance using a flashlight to open a padlock. That night, the pattern clicked into place. They were not random. They were performing a sequence of tasks on our property and possibly others. The police made an overt move, and the night of the intervention, I remember the air tasting metallic with adrenaline. There were multiple conversations and orders, at least 9 exchanges between Sergeant Lewis, Officer Chavez, Tom, me, and the 2 men when they reappeared. I said, "You are under observation." Sergeant Lewis said, "We have a warrant to search the vehicle." The man in the jacket said, "You have nothing." The thinner man said, "We are not doing anything wrong." Officer Chavez said, "Put your hands where I can see them." The thinner man laughed and said, "You are making a scene." Tom said, "I want these men off my property." Sergeant Lewis said, "If you resist, you will be detained." The man in the jacket said, "I will leave."
He moved toward the sedan and his partner moved faster, reaching for the glove box. Officer Chavez said, "Stop." The thinner man said, "You do not have to be rough." Sergeant Lewis said, "Step away from the car." There was a rustle of clothing, a metallic clink like keys hitting concrete, and then Chavez barked, "On the ground now." The scrape of a body on asphalt, the hiss of a cuff. They found a stack of stolen keycards and a small set of duplicate motel keys and a phone loaded with photos of doors. The evidence was poor and circumstantial until they found a ledger with a list of room numbers and times. The ledger had dates that matched the nights we had oddities.
In the aftermath, the police filed charges for trespass and possession of burglary tools. We had a report with a number and a caseworker who said she would follow up. In the immediate hours after their arrest, I felt an odd mixture of relief and a new underlying fear. I slept for the first time in weeks without checking the webcam feed every 30 minutes, but the sleep felt thin and brittle. I went home and I kept my keys on the table where I could see them, like a talisman. The manager, Tom, upgraded our locks. Marcus tightened the cameras. Ethan moved his rig closer to the lot. Janet started a buddy system where staff walked each other to cars. Maya started keeping a kitchen broom by the door in case she needed a tool. We changed the routines that had sheltered the problem. That was the practical fallout, and the emotional cascade was slower. For the first month after the arrests, my hands shook when the doorbell chimed at night, and I replayed the footage until the frames burned into the back of my eyelids. 1 month later, I had resumed working, but with a patch of rawness under the skin of my confidence. I would stand with Sam during his rounds and breathe the cold air and feel grateful for his presence. I wrote in my log, "I will not work alone on nights where patterns repeat," and Tom signed off on rotating shifts so no one person was on for more than 3 nights in a row. The police called to say the suspects were charged with misdemeanor trespass and theft, and that the investigation continued into a possible ring using motel rooms for small-scale theft. They recommended we secure the eaves and add motion sensors. I walked the lot with Marcus and smelled the winter damp and the concrete and knew I would carry that smell for a long time. 3 months after the arrests, the legal process had shown cracks. The suspects had minimal prior records, but not enough to hold on a major charge. Some of the evidence could not link them conclusively to every night as we had hoped. The case felt like a slow leak of justice. Officer Ruiz told me they were monitoring other sites and cross-checking similar reports. We started a community watch with nearby businesses and shared license plate sightings and descriptions. Tom organized a meeting with the local motel owners, and we sat around a metal table and traded stories. We named the men in the report, but the paper could not hold the weight of what we felt. I found myself more cautious, asking for ID at odd hours, double-checking keycard logs, and tracing the scratch marks on the doors where someone had tried to force a latch. I also felt anger at the system that treated our fear like an anecdote until a camera showed the truth. 6 months later, the men had pled to lesser counts and were sentenced to community service and a probationary order keeping them away from the properties they had frequented. It felt insufficient, and yet it was something. The motel installed new locks and a better keycard system and recorded entries with clearer timestamps. I learned to trust a new routine and to teach others to read the shadows. My nights resumed their rhythm, but with an added weight, a taut string under the usual hum. I still check the corners where the light does not reach, and I still keep a photograph of the ledger page that proved our fear. The community watch grew into a small group that exchanged nightly photos of suspicious plates and coordinated with Officer Ruiz when patterns repeated. We learned to treat small anomalies like the first domino because we could not afford to be wrong. I learned a practical lesson about tending to details, about checking cameras 3 times when something felt off, about not letting routine anesthetize attention. If I had one piece of advice, it is this: check the logs, lock the doors, talk to your coworkers, and trust the small alarms our bodies give us. If you work the night shift and you felt your skin prickle while reading this, comment below and say yes and tell us a short line about what happened. Start your line with, "At my shift," so I can find it easily. Your stories matter because they teach others and because a pattern spotted by one person is a net for many. If you want more stories like this, consider subscribing. We share verified reports and small safety measures that can change a night. There are nights when the danger does not pound on the front door. It waits in the shadow between the pumps and the lot light or in the corridor of a motel where cameras do not quite reach. That night taught me that he was not working alone, and neither should anyone who keeps the nocturnal hours. If you walk the midnight corridors, keep your light on and keep talking to the people who cover the same hours. It is easier to ignore a single shiver of fear than to act on it. But acting is what keeps people safe. If this helped you,
If it made you check a log tonight, then that is enough reason to tell more. Because sometimes the best defense is the slow accumulation of details and the courage to share them. Keep the doors locked, keep your head up, and remember that the quiet is not always empty.